All right, friends, buckle up because today's episode of Family Twist is one you do not want to miss. Kendall and I are talking with Connor, whose story about open adoption will have you questioning everything you thought you knew. Imagine knowing your whole life that you're adopted, having access to both your biological and adopted families, yet still feeling like there's a missing piece. Connor takes us deep into his experience, revealing the uncomfortable truth about open adoption, how it's marketed with big promises, but often fails to deliver. And get this, Connor shares a story about being just around the corner from his birth father in Ireland and not taking the chance to meet him. That gut-wrenching moment and the lessons he learned are a reminder of how fragile and complex adoption can be. If you've ever wondered about family secrets, identity struggles, or what it really means to belong, this episode is going to hit you hard. Don't go anywhere. You're going to want to hear every word. Connor, welcome to Family Twist.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So I think a good way to introduce people to your story is I know that you're working on your memoir about open adoption. Can you just talk a little bit about what the premise of the book is going to be?
Yeah, I think growing up, I always knew I was adopted. I've always kind of had this relationship with my natural mother, somewhat at a distance. And then as the older I got, the more close we became, I would say. And now, in many ways, I'm part of her family, but also in many ways, I'm not. And the same can be said about my adoptive family, right? I grew up with them. There's this connection I have with them, but also there's kind of a missing piece in my connection with both of my families. And I think, I'm a marketer, and in my career, I've spent a lot of time looking at advertising just in general. Something as someone in open adoption, I've spent a lot of time kind of reading how open adoption was and is marketed. And I think there's just a lot of, misconceptions, if not lies, about what open adoption looks like that I think need to be revealed, not only for the sake of adopted people, but also for, natural parents, as well as really for the adoptive families, right? How can we equip a family to be successful if part of the equation is deliberately not, kind of keeping a certain piece of that puzzle out of the picture because it makes it easier to facilitate an adoption. The stuff I'm sharing on social media, my memoir that I'm trying to write is hey, open adoption is sold a certain way. And I had, this experience, and I think my experience is pretty independent of how good or bad my adoptive family was for me. There's a lot of complexities that deliberately don't get addressed when an adoption takes place, I would say.
It's interesting because Corey and I talked about this a lot, but probably not on the podcast so much. We've talked about the fact that my adoptive parents were really coached by their attorney and the people involved in my adoption to not have it be open there because of the laws that were in place in the state where I was born at the time. That open adoption wasn't really a possibility for my parents. I think they bought into all the negativity that their attorney brought to the table about how I would feel and how difficult it would be if they had an open adoption. And so I particularly can't wait to read what you write about that because, it really hits home with me.
Now, when Kendall was adopted in 1970, obviously things were a lot different, but what's the marketing message today as far as open adoption goes?
I think open adoption makes a lot of promises that are unenforceable, really. I mean, I describe it really as a marketing tactic because there's promises made to the expectant mother that she's going to see her child, X amount of time, right? But there is this level of expectation that you're going to see your child, which in itself is a form of coercion, right? How can you kind of make an informed decision to consent to an adoption of your child if there's really no actual tangible mechanism that enforces that openness that agencies are so quick to kind of offer up? There's also the promise made to the adoptive family that this is going to be kind of a healing mechanism for the child. It's going to ease all of the trauma of adoption, which most agencies won't even use the T word. It's usually they're going to be happy and this is just going to make it better for them. For the adopted person, really, it's again, it's kind of the same as the promise to the expectant parents of you're going to have two families. On paper, my life in many ways is better than the average life. My child has 6 grandparents when most people's kids don't have that many grandparents. So it's every adopted person kind of has this promise made about their life that your life is going to look this particular way. And even when I was adopted, I remember my adoptive parents telling me that they went through some training, that there was people that were encouraging open adoption. There was like at least one adopted person, at least one, natural mother who relinquished her child, that are all telling you, that open adoption is the right way to go now. And I also think it's important to point out that open adoption really is a response to this closed adoption era that so many people experience, where like open adoption really is just the unsealing, not even unsealing because the records are still sealed, but it's like the ability to access information, really, like that each family has access to each other's information. And I think it's a little bit of I don't know the right term, but it's very self-serving for adoption agencies to kind of blur the line between openness being a legal aspect of the adoption versus openness being this implication of contact between. You hear so many stories about open adoptions closing, but that's not really what closed adoption actually means, like definitionally, right? Like closed adoption means that you don't have access to your own records. Your adoptive family doesn't have access to your own records. It's just a big question mark. And so, yeah, sorry, I think I kind of got lost there. But back to the original question, like I think open adoption kind of makes these promises that they can't keep. And nowadays they call it, I think, like a PACA or something, like a post-adoption contact agreement, where technically, legally speaking, it's enforceable, but there are not many cases of a natural mother or an adopted person going to a court and saying, hey, this contract was violated. I want more visitation, or whatever it is that person wants. And the court actually, granting that to them, because, obviously legal costs are usually going to be outspent by the adoptive family or by whatever forces are against you, the adoption agency, whatever. And I think what's best for the child is that adoption is good. And so you should just be happy with what you have.
And the child would have to be almost making the conscious effort, it's in some cases, to even get that ball rolling, right? Like,
yeah,
if the adopted parents weren't supportive of that action, what's the child going to do on their own?
Especially when you're already like, there's this thought in your head of like, it's happened to me once. If I try to initiate this process, something that I want, what happens if, no one wants me? It's a really like scary thing to think about. And I'm not trying to say that, that's something I thought about constantly when I was a kid, but it's definitely a thought I think in the back of every adopted person's head of like, there's different levels of risk that I can tolerate, because at the end of the day, the number one thing I have to do is avoid another abandonment or relinquishment, whatever you want to call it.
What was your birth mother told at the adoption agency?
That's a good question. I don't really know if I have like talked to her about what kind of guarantees were made. I wouldn't say that anyone in my life besides me has a huge gripe with kind of the way that our open adoption looked like growing up. I saw my mom like once or twice a year, I would say. She got married, moved around a bit as I got older. And so she was living in different states, in different countries. And then she really like settled down with her husband and my siblings around the time I was 18. So there's a part of me that looks back at my life and thinks like my mom probably would have liked to see me more, but I don't really know for sure. And it's not really a question I feel like super comfortable asking. And then I obviously feel like I would have liked to see her more. But then my adoptive parents will say, oh, well, like she wasn't really around. Like, I think the door was always open and she could have come around more. And it's hard to say because there's a part of me that, wants to take everyone for their word. But there's also a part of me that questions, kind of what does everyone truly believe? In conversations I have with people, especially trying to work on this book, the more I talk to people, the more I realize that there is a level of self-preservation in every conversation of like, well, I was just doing what I was doing to protect you, whether it's from one side of my family or one side of my other family, that we were just doing what we thought was best, or this is all for the best, basically. And so it's hard to say like what she was promised because I don't really know. And I don't want to make the implication that she personally feels that it wasn't enough, because we've talked about it and she's very happy, I think, in some ways with the way things are. But in terms of the complexities, that's not really a conversation we've had a lot in our relationship, at least.
Well, I mean, to your point, I think that every situation is so complex that it's probably not a bad thing to think that people just were doing their best.
I think in general that like it's very easy. And I mean, I don't know how often people read my comments on social media, but I get a lot of responses from people that are like, well, you have this negative attitude about adoption. It must have just been a parenting problem, right? You're just adopted by the wrong people. I certainly have my problems with the way I grew up, the way I was raised. I don't think anyone can honestly say they wouldn't have done things a little bit differently if they were their own parents. But I really feel that the system purposely cannot equip, like, it's by design, you cannot equip an adoptive family to say, hey, you're raising someone else's child, and in that same breath get them to kind of spend, $50,000 on a child, right? I've used this analogy before. No one's paying $50,000 to be an auntie, right? People really want this exclusive level of ownership or this ability to be the parent. And I don't think that my adoptive family was possessive. Like, yet they always kind of, referenced my natural mother. They never really called her my mom. They're like, oh, it's your birth mom, or they called her by her first name. But there was a level of acknowledgement of her existence and importance in my life. But it's just really complicated. Like I said, you just can't really, those two things can't coexist in peace, at least in a way that I've seen. I've looked through a lot of ethical adoption agencies to see what do they say they're doing that other agencies aren't doing. And it's still kind of the same thing. It's very much like, we got to pay the bills, and to pay the bills, you have to sell people this idea of exclusive ownership. I mean, it's good for the child to have a connection with their family, but ultimately it's like, it's their connection with this part of themselves. It's not really like, oh, they have an actual second family that they can go and sleep over with if they want to.
You talked about some of the feedback that you get on social media. Does it generally fall into one category, or just people not understanding why you would have any kind of issue with adoption?
I think that a big part of my mission and what I'm doing, because I've seen a lot of adopted people share their experiences. I've listened to your podcast, a lot of other podcasts, read a lot of books. And a lot of adopted people, for better or for worse, and probably for better, tend to focus on adopted people's experiences and healing and maybe even reforming the adoption industry. But it tends to be directed at adopted people of like, well, here's what we can do as adopted people to group together and really make a difference. And when I like first started sitting down and thinking about what do I want to do when I share my story publicly, I thought, well, how do I talk to the guy on the corner who's never heard anything about adoption? How do I get him to understand like what my experience is like? When I was in Ireland in September, and my wife and I and my kid, we were all like right around the corner basically from my natural father in Ireland, who I've never met, who's kept me a complete secret from everyone in his life. And I had an opportunity to I knew where he would be and when he would be there. My kid is sleeping at night. And so my wife and I are like in the same room, texting each other because we don't want to wake her up. And I texted my wife, like, I've really been thinking about this. Do you want to go and see my dad? And she was like, I'm not sure, and she's heard me tell the stories of being rejected before. And obviously is very familiar with the fact that, I'm probably not welcome wherever I show up. And that was a huge wake up call for me of like, if I can't really explain to my wife why this is like the most important thing in the universe in this moment, how can I explain to someone who knows nothing about adoption that my life is complicated, that this is something that I would want, right? And so obviously it was a really difficult moment and something I definitely want to write about in my book. But at the same time, it was a huge learning experience for me because I realized that I really have to be the one to sell this to people. I hope every adopted person who wants to do that can do it and will do it. But I feel like there's a big gap in terms of a lot of these experiences these stories and sharing take place in somewhat of a bubble. And I feel like I can be the person to pop that bubble. So going back to your original question, a lot of the feedback I get from people is from people who've really never heard it before. A lot of people hear something I say about adoption and think, wow, you're so ungrateful, or whatever it may be, right? We've all heard that before. But I don't mind. I can take it, right? I feel like if I'm the one who can kind of get jabbed by someone who hears something negative about adoption is like, you're crazy, adoption's awesome, then the next time they're exposed to that message, whether it be by me or someone else, the reaction won't be as hostile or as aggressive. People don't have to accept that adoption is, however I feel it is, or however another adopted person feels it is. But I think that the dialogue can change when more people are just exposed to this broad idea that adoption is painful and complicated and all these other things.
Yeah, I think you make a good point because there are many people in my adoptive family that I think could have benefited from your sort of message because, all I ever heard as I got older, became a teenager and started saying that I'd like to meet my biological family someday, my adoptive mother's family, it was met with, gosh, don't you love us? Don't you respect us? Don't you, aren't you worried about upsetting the family? And it wasn't harsh, but it definitely was planting that seed that would lead me to feel guilty as an older teenager when I did start trying to find people. And that's not fair. That's not fair to me as a child, growing up. And my mother's sister and I were very close, and we could be very blunt with each other. And I would say to my aunt, this isn't cool. You need to shut up, or we won't talk. And that's sort of the approach I had to take at that point in my life. I said, I knew that my parents supported it. It's just funny how people want you to keep your mouth shut and just live by their rules. And I said, that's just not going to happen.
I'm really sorry that happened to you. I feel like that's such a common experience. I think that, for whatever criticisms that a lot of people like me have about adoption, I think one thing they have figured out is like people who are going to adopt children, by and large, recognize that it is something important to the child. Whether or not they're willing to accept it is another thing. But, like broad society doesn't understand the importance of it, I would say, necessarily yet. But in the circles of adoption, people do understand, which is a positive.
If you had the opportunity to relive that moment again when you were around the corner from your birth father, would you do things differently?
100%. I remember flying home. I remember exactly where we were. I remember looking out the window right above Orange County, California, and thinking, this is the exact part of the desert I was looking at when I had this coming to Jesus moment where I'm like, I'm never making that mistake again. I was like a couple hours away from home. It took me a long time between then. That was like probably a couple of weeks after I had that opportunity, and I was about to get home, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, I can't believe I did that. I read my grandma's obituary last year, and I was like, it would have been great to meet her before she died, and like, what could happen to my dad, between now and whenever the next opportunity I have is. So yeah, I mean, I've listened to a lot of adopted people share their experiences about searching, and obviously searching for a father in general in adoption is much less common than searching for a mother. I think that's just something I was always interested in because that was the only question. I mean, I had question marks about my mom's family, but the only major question mark I really had was about my dad. And yeah, I mean, for me, every adopted person is able to feel however they want to feel about searching. But for me, it's really like, I think a very common adoption experience of like, I want to know where I come from. I want to know what my family's like. And also, I mean, I shared my story more in depth in other places, but being adopted from having an actual Irish father who lives in Ireland, and that's like his whole family tree, just Ireland. It feels kind of like an intercountry adoption, and kind of like this, this missing part of my life, as well as this connection I have to Ireland and this family that I really don't. I mean, I know some interesting information about my family, but ultimately not that much. And funny like refrain that I don't think I've even shared publicly before. But when I was in Ireland, I have shared this, that I ran into this guy who knows my dad, and I told him, like, I'm my father's son, and he was like, looked like he saw a ghost. He was like, what is this guy talking about? I was like, what, do I not look like him? He's like, no, you look like him. I was like, oh, okay. I run into this guy who knows my dad, and it turns out that I don't know anything about my dad. I just know he plays Gaelic football, which is like the number one sport in Ireland. I want to ask this guy like anything about my dad, and he's telling me a lot of stuff I already know. Oh, your dad has this many siblings. They grew up over here. Everything I've looked it up all online. Like, I know my dad's name. I know who his wife is. I know like who my siblings are. None of them, I think, know about me, or if they have gotten a message from me, I don't really put it past them that they would just think I'm some American trying to con them or something. This guy, I don't even ask him a single question. I wanted to know, what does my dad do for work? I didn't even ask him what my dad's job was. And I remember, this is crazy, I talked to this guy for like 10 minutes. He's really friendly, really nice. We drive away. I'm like, I got to go back and talk to this guy again. I go back and talk to him for another 10, 15 minutes and have a great conversation. I'm like, hey man, I feel really bad. Don't go around telling everyone that, that I'm looking for my dad. I'm like, hey, like, I just don't want anyone to be under the impression that I'm trying to, pop open this Pandora's box. I was just I found him at this place that we had this common. I knew that like my dad grew up in this area, and I drove away, and I was like, I didn't even ask him what my dad does for work. I didn't ask him a single question. I think it's like this trance that adopted people get put into of like, oh my gosh, I can't disturb the peace. I can't get my own answers here. And yeah, I mean, maybe it's easy for me to say that I'll go back and do things different, but who knows, right? I think like it's very possible this spell takes a new life and puts me back into this mode where I have to be complicit or whatever. But I really don't think so at this point. I made that choice because ultimately I just don't really feel like I mean, there's nothing I have with them right now. So what am I really losing by speaking my or sharing my experience? And so, yeah.
That's exactly the way I feel about my birth mother's family. I feel like, and she's had 7 years to connect with me. And if she hasn't, that's on her. And I'm moving on and telling my truth, and
Yeah.
she'll just deal.
And I'm sure it's hard for people to handle that. People are like, why would you do that? Like, have you thought about his marriage or their family or whatever? And it's like, yeah, I mean, I thought about that for 20 whatever years, but why should I be responsible for keeping this secret that I had no say in,
Absolutely. The longer it goes, the older I get, the less patience I have with dealing with that kind of bullshit. And it just gets on my nerves. It's like, I'm tired of trying to own her side of the conversation, and trying to justify my feelings. I'm allowed to have these feelings, and I'm allowed to be resentful toward her for, keeping me a secret. Still, to your point, her family doesn't, well, her immediate family knows about me, but my mother's father is like one of like 13 kids. And supposedly nobody on that side of the family knows that I exist, which I think is probably not true. But, it's just comical to me. It's like, I'm 54 years old. Like, when do I stop being the dirty little secret?
There's so much shame in adoption, dude. I have a grandpa, my biological mother's father lives maybe closer to me than any family member I have. And I live in the same city as like 3 family members. I've never met him. I don't even know if he knows I exist. I had an opportunity to meet him. I could meet him today if I wanted to. I could figure it out, right? But there's this weird kind of like elephant in the room in adoption where it feels like there's this shame that someone else has, like my mother or whoever, and I don't want to impose on her or someone else to be like, hey, I want to go meet your dad who you don't have a great relationship with or whatever it may be. I don't think my mom would necessarily have anything against me going and meeting him. Yeah. But there's this weird kind of like line that you don't want to cross of, well, I don't want to do it unless someone gives me explicit permission. And it's, like you said, it's bullshit. I mean, like we should be able to kind of figure out who we are and meet whoever like whatever relatives we have that we want to meet. But yeah, adoption doesn't really let us have that. I mean, I guess technically, again, we sometimes have the option, but it doesn't really feel that until society changes and gives us that permission collectively that we actually have that permission.
You're exactly right. And Corey's way too polite to say this about me, but I can be very prideful at times. And part of it I know about my story is they don't want to talk to me. I don't want to talk to them. You know what I mean? Like it just becomes this barrier and this thing that I've created, but it's there. And it's a self-preservation moment, where, you've had 7 years to talk to me. You don't talk to me. Even if you called me tomorrow, I might do the same thing. And that's probably not true. I would probably melt in a moment and say,
it's hard to tell. I feel like our brains get mad. Anne Heffron's You Don't Look Adopted was a huge game-changing book for me because she talks so much about kind of just the way adoption affects our brains. And I feel like you have this other voice in your head that's telling you can't do this or you can do this. And it's like, I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I have multiple personality disorder just for having like the normal adoption feeling. So yeah, I don't think you're prideful for having those feelings. I mean, it's very normal to have this massive level of feeling like there's these conflicts of interest and there's these allegiances, even in open adoption, where you feel like to go one way is to oppose the other side, right? It's bullshit. Adoption shouldn't be an act of replacement, but it still today is sold as an act of replacement. It should be an act of addition. What about child welfare suggests that the welfare of a child should be erasing family from that child? It doesn't make sense.
Right. And we always say, maybe it was Corey who said it, but how can you have too much love? I mean, if you're getting love from multiple families, whether they're biological or adoptive. Who cares? Like that to me, for the child's sake, is what we should all be focused on.
Totally.
Yeah, I do. I get very excited and very emotional when I hear the stories about people who but we've heard, the good stories, and we've also heard the heartbreaking ones as well.
Totally.
But man, to have that chutzpah to go and knock on the door, like, good for you.
I mean, I didn't knock on the door. I wish I did. It's hard to say.
I'm definitely one of those people who probably would have done it even if I knew that the outcome would have been bad. I'm such a curious soul, I think. And, like Corey and I, when we found my biological family in August 2017, we were immediately making plans. We lived in San Francisco. The family's on the West Coast. We were immediately making plans for how quickly can we get to New England to meet these people. It was just one of those.
It was full steam ahead, but you just don't know. There's no manual for how to do this.
No, right.
No. Yeah.
And everybody's going to do it a different way.
I don't regret them then.
Yeah.
Totally. You can't. Yeah. I mean, and interesting, like, aside, like, I'm going on vacation with, like, my mom and my whole family, like, this summer. It's like the first time, like, my family's going, their family, like, everyone's going. It's like this going to be this huge vacation. And it's like you said, there's really no playbook for it. It's, I think, a theme of what I'm trying to write in my book, which I haven't shared that much, like, publicly, is that I think reunion, at least for me, even in this open adoption, is like a constant search for lost time. I knew my family. I never, like, I have, like, the one known family and then the one unknown family, right? I've always had this known family. They've always been a part of my life. I've always, in some way, been a part of theirs. But I can't go back in time and have the childhood that I would have had with them. There's all these inside jokes that I missed out on, all of these experiences that I missed out on. I've never spent a Christmas with them, even though I grew up, like, in an open adoption, quote unquote. And again, like, sometimes they weren't in the same city as me. Sometimes they were. It feels like that's something that I don't think people would expect when they hear open adoption. But yeah, I mean, it's just complicated and different. And those relationships are very difficult to navigate, even when you have positive relationships with everyone, which I would say that I generally tend to have a somewhat positive relationship at any given moment with everyone in all of my families.
Briefly going back to the trip to Ireland, what was the purpose of that trip?
Oh, just vacation. I'd been to Ireland previously in 2015. I was there after studying abroad, and I remember the first time I went to Ireland feeling this profound emotional connection. I'm pretty sure I cried multiple times just being in Ireland. That was huge for me. And I mean, what year is it? 2025. So it'd been almost 10 years since I'd been to Ireland. I'd gotten married, I'd had a kid. And again, I was just having, my kid's like 2. And so I started coming out of the fog a couple of years ago and really started to think about this adoption stuff. I wouldn't say that I necessarily felt like I had this, like, clock that was ticking in my head about, you never know, like, your dad could die or something could happen and this might be your only chance. But I was at the same time, we hadn't been to Europe in a long time. And I love Ireland just as a country in general. I think a lot of people who don't have that connection to Ireland just love Ireland. I thought it'd be a great place to visit. And so we spent, like, I think, like, 2 or 3 weeks in Ireland doing a road trip around the whole country. I'd been to Dublin and Galway, like the 2 big cities, but I hadn't really been anywhere else. So we saw a lot of the country together. Again, there was just kind of this, the explicit purpose was not to go and try to find my dad. But the first time I'd been there, I didn't even know really where my dad lived. I hadn't done a lot of the, like, digging that I had done since then. And so I just knew, hey, we're going to stop in this city that, my dad grew up in. I don't want to give away too much information that might make me sound like a stalker, but I went around the city, like, I kind of knew places to look at, places of interest, and just to kind of see the city that, my family is from. My family's from Central Ireland, and I mean, it's from a very, very small town that no one's probably heard of in America, but my family lived in the city that was, like, the central place of where the Irish famine happened. I mean, that had no bearing on, my father's generation or probably even the generation before him. But it's interesting because, like, when I was a kid, I was super interested in Ireland. All I really knew was, potato famine, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, okay, well, I don't really know what any of that means. And then when I went to, my father's hometown, we got to, like, go to the National Famine Museum in Ireland. And it was like, oh, this is crazy. Like, I had no clue that, I have this connection to literally, like, the central hub of, like, this, profound suffering or whatever. But, like, it was interesting that like I had this connection to this part of Ireland. And prior to that trip, I'd been learning as much Irish as I could. I could read a lot of the street signs, listening to music, reading books, doing everything I could because again, it's like I'm like a half domestic, half international adoptee. And so I felt like I really wanted to kind of just go back to this place that I'd been learning so much about. And I wanted my wife and my kid to experience it too. Ultimately, it wasn't an explicit intention to find my dad, but it definitely was on the table, I would say. And for me, a big part of that was my kid being like, I don't want something to happen and my child to never have the ability to kind of like have that the day that they see, their grandparent or whatever, even if it's just we're sitting on the bleachers, and staring at them from a distance or something like that. But I really I just wanted to kind of see if I could make that happen. And again, it's something that I think if I was able to be more like forthright about how I truly felt in that given moment when I had that conversation with my wife, or even beforehand of saying, hey, you know what? Like prior to going to Ireland, hey, I'm going to try to make this happen. And you can come with me. You can not come with me, whatever it would be. I think she would support me. But like, I really didn't give myself permission to be that like actually like forthright about how I felt and like what my intentions were. Even with myself, I'd be on the phone with friends. Oh, you're going to Ireland. Are you going to go try to see your dad? It's like, oh, maybe not. I couldn't actually decide. And that indecisiveness, I think, is really what led to kind of me being a coward and not like taking that step when I really could have taken the step. And it's funny, like the next day we went to the Cliffs of Moher, which is like the number one tourist attraction in Ireland. And we had amazing weather the entire trip. We go to the Cliffs of Moher and it is awful weather. You can't see like 5 feet in front of you. And I was like, that's just God telling me I made the wrong choice.
That's exactly what happened to me when I went there. It was like really, really difficult to see. And it's kind of miserable. I was like, well, this is beautiful on postcards.
The first time I went there, it was awesome. You can't see anything, yeah.
When you're trying to show your...
Right. Yeah, I was like, we got to go to the cliffs. Yeah. It's so cool. And then, of course, that's the one day with the... I mean, the rest of the trip was amazing, though, so I didn't care.
Yeah.
It's funny how much our maps have changed over the last, 7 years. We did another membership with one of the companies last year. Kendall always talks about his trip to Ireland and how he just absolutely loved Cork and everything. And of course, then it turns out like that's where his, that's his top city. Yeah. Which I didn't know with where I went. Yeah.
I was secretly hoping we were there. I'm like, hey, to my wife, like, ever want to move here one day? And when we were in Cork, she was like, if we did move to Ireland, I could see us living here. I was Cork like, hell yeah.
It is my favorite. Because I kind of did what you did. My ex and I went for 3 weeks and we flew into Shannon. We drove down the western coast, kind of meandered through the inland and then along the southern coast and then ended the trip up in Dublin. It was fantastic because you hit a lot of the big cities like Galway and great towns, but then you went to these tiny, tiny villages. The dichotomy was just really cool.
The only place in the world, well, not the only place, but the only place in the English-speaking world, you'll get stuck behind a tractor every time you drive.
Yes. Yeah, I was commenting to a colleague at work this past week who's planning a trip to Ireland. I said, now it could have changed. It's been quite some time since I've been there, but I remember so many times when you're going between those small villages where you're on a road that is so small that even in a tiny car, if another vehicle was coming toward you, I'm like, I don't know how this works.
Yeah, you got to go on the side and park, basically.
It was crazy. I was practically in a ditch trying to let this truck get past me. And it was just kind of comical. I was like, well, I don't know if we'll ever get the car out of here. But it was fun. It was one of my favorite vacations ever.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
So, Connor, have you thought about, like, if you do decide to encounter your father, what's the first thing you'd say to him?
I've thought about that, I don't want to act like I have this book all figured out. I haven't written a single chapter yet. I have just endless notes on notepads that I'm trying to sort into different chapters here. And I really am trying to get it out fast because I feel like now's the time to write it. But the one thing I'll say is the last part of the book I want to end with, and I mean, things could change. I could sell it to a publisher or not sell it, but I could sell it to a publisher and the publisher's like, no, you're not going to do this at the end. I don't know. But my current vision for what the ending of the book looks like is just a letter to my father and his family and kind of my thoughts. In terms of like, what would I say right now? I'm not really sure. I mean, I think it's hard. Like my whole childhood, anytime I had issues with being adopted, anytime I was acting out or being really upset, like the anger would very often get directed towards my dad. That, oh, if this guy wasn't just such a bad dude, then your life would have been different, or your anger wouldn't be here, even though that would also mean that I wouldn't be living in this with this family or whatever. But I really only heard negative things about him. And so for many years of my life, I was trying to make peace with a guy that I really today don't feel like I have anything to forgive him for. I don't necessarily hold it against him that in a contraception Ireland that he wasn't really willing to parent a child that he had with his girlfriend. And I don't even really know how official that relationship was. So yeah, in terms of what would I say? I mean, I don't know. Honestly, I've thought about that, and I've envisioned us just standing in front of each other, staring and not knowing what to say. I feel like I'm at a place where I just kind of want to see him, to hear him, and then whatever he's comfortable with, I feel like I can make peace with. Maybe that's easy to say, being someone who's, eons away from that happening, or that I wouldn't have an additional level of curiosity once that kind of tickles my itch or whatever. But yeah, I just feel like I don't know anything about him. He probably doesn't know anything about me. So I just want to kind of tell him this is what my life has been like. This is who I am. This is what my family is. And yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, I've enjoyed just hanging out with my biological father. It's not that he and I like tons of things in common or our backgrounds are quite different the way we were raised, but it's just cool to hang out. It's nice to get to know him. And yeah, he's not the most inquisitive. He's one of the least inquisitive people that you can ever meet. So I feel like when I'm dishing him information about myself, he takes it, but he isn't the guy who's going to ask for that information.
Yeah. I don't imagine my father's much different.
What we found to help us bond with Kendall's birth father was music. That was something that, we love music, and his dad loves music. So something Kendall and I had been talking about recently is, for our other podcasts, we always have to ask the same, last question. So when you're feeling a certain way about family, or you're working on your memoir, is there a certain artist or a song that you go to?
Oh man, I can't say this publicly. Okay, I'll say it. Okay. The song "Father of Mine" by Everclear was my depressed, crying in the shower song for my whole childhood. It's weird because I think it's very symbolic of kind of this misunderstanding I had about my own circumstances, that it was my dad's choice, right? I didn't really understand that my mom had a say, and to say that my mom had a say is almost putting I don't really know if that's even fair to say, because ultimately adoptions, especially post baby scoop era, and obviously during the baby scoop era, there's always a level of coercion involved, I would say, in this consent that the mother's giving, right? How can you fully give informed consent to an adoption when there's so many external forces that have a financial interest in you saying yes to this? But going back to what I'm saying about my mom and my dad, my impression was always that it was just my dad, right? It was my dad's fault. If my dad just stayed with my mom, that we would, the things would be different. My life would be different. I don't know how it would be. I don't know if it'd be better or worse, but I would, whatever complaints I have about this current life wouldn't exist, because I'd be in some parallel universe. And again, yeah, I just think it shows how naive I was, that I thought my daddy, the chorus, my daddy gave me away. And Everclear's "Father of Mine," my dad didn't really give me away. They got him to sign his consent for termination of parental rights, but it's not really he was the one leading the charge there. And yeah, as far as I want to give a happier song too, I guess. Gosh, I don't know if I have a happier song though. My mom and I danced. I had at my wedding, but I had both of my moms walk me down the aisle. I had a first dance with both of them. My biological mom, I want to say that she had a song that she listened to when she was pregnant with me by Van Morrison, but I don't remember the song. I also don't even remember if it was Van Morrison, but yeah. Okay, here's a song, okay? Or maybe not a song. I'll give you an album that is probably totally different from anything that your fans are probably used to listening to. I'm a huge reggae fan, and there's a Jamaican artist named Protege who has an album called "In Search of Lost Time." And that is, I think, the biggest theme in my open adoption is being in search of lost time. And yeah, I bought that record and I've listened to it a lot. I love Protege, but I don't know if there's any specific one word or like phrase from that album that stands out. But yeah, I just love Protege, so I'll recommend that one.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely have to have you back on when the book is ready to be published.
Totally. See you in 10 years.
Ooh, what a ride. Connor's story left us with goosebumps. I mean, the way he talks about the promises of open adoption as nothing more than marketing tactics, it's eye-opening. And that moment in Ireland, knowing his birth father was so close, but feeling paralyzed to make a move, that's real, raw, and unfiltered truth. Adoption isn't just a fairy tale of finding your forever home. It's layered with complex emotions, missed opportunities, and a constant search for lost time. And when Connor said adoption shouldn't be an act of replacement, it should be an act of addition, it really hits home for us. If you know someone who's struggled with family secrets identity or the weight of wanting more from their story, please share this episode with them. And let's keep this important conversation going. Until next time, remember, family secrets are the ultimate plot twist. The Family Twist podcast is presented by Savoir Faire Marketing Communications and produced by How the Cow Ate the Cabbage, LLC.